Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a world of shadows and silkware music drips like honey from open windows, and secrets are traded with the rays of a painted eyebrow. You're wandering through the lantern-lit alleyways of ancient China, following the soft slap of embroidered slippers, the smell of plum wine on the breeze, and the faint pluck of a zither somewhere just out of sight. This is the realm of the courtesan, not quite concubine, not quite entertainer, but something in between. A performer of grace, wit, and carefully veiled manipulation. You probably won't survive this place, let's be honest. A misplaced compliment. A wrong tone during tea service, or even breathing too loudly near the wrong eunuch could get you banned, beaten, or worse made, to recite poetry badly in public. It's that kind of high-stakes low-visibility world, where beauty is both a weapon and a currency, and one misstep could cost you a dynasty. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments, because I love seeing where you're all dozing off from now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Together, you step over a moonlit threshold into the Han Dynasty's nighttime underbelly. The capital Chang'an is beginning to glow. Lanterns swing on thin chains from every eave, painting the courtyards with flickering pools of orange light. The streets shimmer with damp stone, and the air is thick with lotus blossom and fermented rice. Here, the courtesans aren't just ornamental. They're instruments of influence, finely tuned. You hear the patter of trained laughter drifting out of wooden tea houses. Inside, it's all lacquered floors, low tables, and sleeves long, enough to hide a scroll or a dagger. One glance at the seating arrangements tells you who's in power tonight. The civil official lounging closest to the courtesan, with peacock feathers in her hair, fanning him with the kind of ease that comes only with serious practice. Historians still argue whether courtesans were state-sponsored or semi-autonomous in this early period. What's clearer is that they weren't just pretty faces. Many were literate more than most merchants and even minor officials. They knew how to pace a conversation, steer it gently toward matters of trade routes or succession, then retreat with plausible deniability before any real names were mentioned. You sit cross-legged on a worn mat, trying to blend in. A servant pours tea scented with osmanthus blossoms into your cup, and across the room, a courtesan begins to sing. Her voice is soft and low, meant to lull, not dazzle. The melody isn't famous, but you recognize the undercurrent. It's coded, a reference to a failed rebellion, or maybe just a forbidden love. She meets your gaze for a moment too long, then shifts her eyes away. That was either an invitation, or a warning, or both. Out in the courtyard, others recline under ginkgo trees, watching a slow dance where each footfall is choreographed to stir the robes, just enough not too much. You see no drunken debauchery here. This is finesse, strategy, elegance wrapped around ambition. The courtesans of this era aren't competing for affection. They're cultivating patrons like bonsai trees, trimming excess emotion and nudging growth with precise, deliberate charm. One woman leans in close to a retired general, whispering something that makes him freeze mid-sip. You'll never know what she said, but you'll later hear that same general suddenly reversed his stance on military spending. Coincidence? Maybe, but probably not. A quirky footnote lost in most textbooks. Han courtesans often dabbled in alchemy. Not the Ladon Mercury kind you're imagining, although yes, there was a bit of that. No, this was more subtle. They used herbs and rituals, not just to keep their skin. Youthful mugwort steams and pearl powder were the go-to anti-aging trio, but also to craft love potions, mostly placebo wine infusions, with names like Petal of the Moon or Emperors. Forgetfulness, guaranteed to either seduce or confuse your chosen noble, depending on the dosage. As you sink deeper into your borrowed mat, you start to feel the rhythm of the place. Conversations glide from poetry to politics to personal grief without missing a beat. A man quietly weeps as a courtesan hums a lullaby his mother used to sing. Another boasts about the size of his rice granary, prompting a gentle eye roll from a woman who's clearly heard it all before. Everyone plays their role. In this twilight world, time slows. Your mind softens at the edges. you begin to understand. This isn't a world of fast decisions or bold declarations. It's a place of insinuation, of emotional sleight of hand, and you're just passing through. A shadow among silk-clad ghosts who speak in metaphors and move like water over stones. Outside, the lanterns are beginning to dim. A few have burned down to stubby orange embers. Somewhere behind the walls, someone laughs in their sleep. Maybe a drunk courtier. Maybe a courtesan dreaming of a different life. Or maybe just the wind playing tricks on your ears. You lie back, eyes half closed, and think, this is only the beginning. There's an entire architecture of desire and duty ahead, one zither pluck at a time. You wake, or at least shift your weight slightly, to find yourself still surrounded by gauzy curtains and the muffled echo of string instruments. The air smells faintly of sandalwood, and something spicier, maybe the powdered root of a flower you couldn't name even if you were fully awake. A courtesan brushes past you without acknowledgement, trailing a scent that's less perfume and more performance. You're in her space now, and every inch of it is curated tonight. You learn something strange. In ancient China, beauty could be a legitimate bureaucratic tool, and you're a minor official with a scroll of grain tax quotas tucked under your arm, hoping the right compliments might buy you influence, or at least help you dodge a promotion to some mosquito-ridden province. But you're not the only one with an agenda. The courtesan sitting across from you, her face lit delicately by the glow of a hanging oil lamp, doesn't ask what your rank is. She already knows. She also knows which faction you're loyal to, how many daughters you have, and what you whispered to that eunuch at the banquet last week. Her jade earrings swing slightly as she pours you plum wine. She doesn't drink, not yet. That's part of the game. Historians still argue whether directly influenced political outcomes or merely observed them from the sidelines. But when you see this woman casually mention the name of a rival minister in the middle of a conversation about cloud patterns, you realize the line between court and chamber is blurrier than you thought. You've probably heard of the famed 4 arts of the Chinese scholar gentleman, Qin the zither key strategy games like Go, Shu calligraphy, and Hua painting. What your Confucian examiners didn't tell you is that courtesans were expected to master the exact same skills, then surpass them with flair. You, dear listener, probably practiced your brushstrokes until your wrist ached. She does them, upside down, drunk, while reciting a Thames poem and making you question your life choices. A courtesan's greatest weapon, not her hair, her lips, or her robes, though those don't hurt, it's timing. She speaks when silence is loudest, laughs when the tension rises, and falls perfectly still when you're about to reveal something you shouldn't. You catch yourself talking too much, complimenting too freely, and somewhere in your head, a voice says, she's disarming you, and she hasn't even touched her cup. Some were more than artists of social grace, they were deployed like couriers of diplomacy. Take the famous tale of Li Zhu, a courtesan of the late Han era. The story goes that she was gifted to a visiting official from a rival province during a tense negotiation. Instead of idle flirtation, she played a melancholy tune on the guqin that subtly mirrored a secret folk song known only in his region. It was a coded message, the historians suggest, an offer, a warning, a veiled insult. No one agrees, but he left the next day, treaty unsigned, and the grain routes remained blocked for months. You shift your seat as the courtesan beside you begins to sketch something on a thin piece of rice paper. At first, it looks like a lotus flower. Then you notice the shape hidden in the folds of the petals, a dragon's tail, just barely there. She folds the paper without a word and tucks it into your sleeve. You'll spend the next 3 days trying to decode it. Fun fact, certain hair ornaments were believed to signal specific messages. A jade hairpin slanted left, mourning a recent breakup. A plum blossom tucked behind the right ear, open to philosophical discussion, not physical touch. Or so the guidebooks claimed. Most of these were completely invented by male poets trying to make sense of rejection. And speaking of poets, nearly every man who fell for a courtesan eventually tried to write one into a verse. The results varied wildly. Some were transcendent, others sounded like bad karaoke. Many women learn to smile graciously while mentally ranking the worst metaphors involving moonlight, swans, or silk. You lean back, swirling your wine, watching her arrange the sleeves of her robe, as if she were folding origami. The more you observe, the more you realize the visual world here is choreographed. The curve of her eyebrow, the tilt of her fan, the precise angle at which she looks at but not quite into her eyes. This is diplomacy without documents. Every gesture is its own letter, sealed in red powder and carried on a breeze. Still, even in this gilded world, danger always hums beneath the surface. One misstep could cost her everything. A smile offered to freely might be seen as presumptuous. A refusal delivered too bluntly might anger someone powerful. Courtesans were expected to live in paradox. Powerful, but powerless. Desired, yet disposable. You see it in the way she pauses before saying your name, calculating gently whether you're worth the gamble. You hear, muffled through a curtain, the rise of another tune. A different courtesan is performing for a group of military officers. The rhythm is more aggressive, the melody sharper. Each group gets a different version of the dream, tailored to their fantasies and weaknesses. You suddenly feel very small in the grand architecture of charm. Just then, a servant brings you a small plate. On it, a plum sliced into the shape of a crane. You look at it dumbly for a moment, then realize it's a reference to a poem you quoted earlier. She remembered, or someone did. Either way, you've been catalogued. Your host finally lifts her cup to drink, just a sip. You realize, the conversation is now over. You've been seen, catalogued, possibly manipulated, and you feel oddly grateful. You exit back into the humid night, mind spinning, robes trailing slightly in the dust. The sky is moonless, and the lanterns sway in their iron cradles. Somewhere, a bell chimes midnight, and you can't help but wonder how many decisions began with a sip of plum wine and a glance from a woman who technically wasn't allowed to hold office. You don't remember falling asleep, but somehow, you've drifted straight into a new city. Still ancient but louder, brighter Chang'an, in full Tang Dynasty bloom. It's bigger now, grander too, with 12 million feet hurrying across. Stone avenues and ox-drawn carts clattering past pagodas, their tiled roofs sharp against a pink-hued sky. You trail behind a slow-moving litter borne by servants, catching snippets of laughter and the soft jingling of silver hairpieces. You're headed for the pleasure quarters, the fabled green towers. Don't get excited. This isn't a rowdy brothel strip. It's more like a cross between an elite performing arts campus, a diplomatic embassy, and a live-action fanfiction. Here, entire neighborhoods exist solely for aesthetic indulgence. You pass through carved wooden gates into the Pink Kang district, where the sun never quite fully sets. Lanterns bloom like flowers. Perfumed smoke curls from window slats. You're definitely not in the civil service wing anymore. The courtesans here are of a different class, literally referred to as Yiji. They weren't common entertainers or concubines, but trained professionals. Some were wealthy in their own right, running their own households, managing investments, and even hiring male assistants. Yes, that's right. They had staff, they weren't owned, they rented space. They negotiated terms. If you misbehaved, you could be blacklisted faster than you could say new verse about chrysanthemums. Historians still debate whether the pleasure quarters were a form of soft imprisonment or subtle liberation. The truth, as usual, probably sat right in the middle on a lacquered bench beside a zither. Within these walls, courtesans had more freedom of speech and education than many upper-class wives. But step outside, and society snapped back like a taut bowstring. You step through another screen door and into a hall glowing with red silk and low flickering oil lamps. A woman glides past, balancing a tray of candied lotus seeds. Her robe is layered in soft golds and indigos, and her eyebrows have been painted into delicate crescent moons. You hear laughter from a side chamber. It's flirtatious, but calculated. This is where stories begin, mostly tragic, occasionally comedic, and always written in smoke. You're ushered into a sitting room, where a courtesan is mid-conversation with a pair of visiting scholars. She isn't just tolerating their monologues, playing verbal badminton. batting theories back at them with an ease that makes one of them literally drop his fan in awe. She's not reciting facts. She's twisting them into analogies, laced with humor and quiet barbs. When one scholar quotes Confucius, she counters with a Taoist proverb. The other laughs nervously. She smiles without showing teeth, a quirky detail. About these pleasure quarters, there were walking paths that looped endlessly, designed for strolling while reciting poetry. Think of it as literary speed dating. A man might begin a verse aloud, and if a courtesan overheard it and liked it, she might finish the couplet as she passed. That wasn't just flirtation, it was social vetting. Finish a poem well. You're worth talking to. Mess it up. You'd better pivot to complimenting her shoes and hope for mercy as you wander deeper into the quarter. You begin to see how this place is structured like an opera. Music schools tucked behind gardens. Calligraphy salons with brushes that cost more than your lifetime's earnings. Even a tiny stage built over a koi pond, where the boldest courtesans perform scenes from classic plays with subtle edits. Of course, because some characters were just too whiny to be bearable. You pass a room where courtesans are rehearsing a duet. Their voices interweave like brocade, not trying to impress, just to harmonize. You stop at the threshold, listening. The song is about a fisherman who falls in love with a dragon disguised as a woman. It's an old folktale, but here it takes on layers. The dragon chooses to leave not because she's rejected, but because she knows how the story ends. Maybe that's the real fantasy. The woman choosing the plot twist. You glance up and notice the architectural trick at play. The ceilings are low. The door is always slightly off-center. Nothing is symmetrical. It keeps you disoriented charmingly so. Every angle suggests intimacy. Every hallway, a secret. It's not just aesthetics. It's psychological landscaping, and now something a bit more material. The menus. Yes, menus. Some elite houses had bound scrolls describing their courtesans, specialties, music styles, poetry preferences, favorite conversation topics. Think of it as a dating app curated by a poet with too much time on his hands. You'd pick someone, not for her looks alone, but for how she annotated Zhuangzi, or her opinion on plum wine aging techniques. It wasn't cheap. A single evening with a high-ranking Yiji could cost as much as an ox cart full of jade figurines. But it wasn't about the money. It was about access. You weren't paying to flirt, you were paying to be seen in her presence. The real currency here was reputation, and hers was probably more stable than your dynasty's economy. Out on a covered balcony, you watch another pair of patrons exit. One looks dazed, the other euphoric. You suspect neither of them understood half the conversation they just had, but they'll remember the elegance, the care, the perfectly arranged night. And somewhere below, a musician begins to play again. Slow, deliberate notes. You lean against the wooden rail, eyes half closed, heartbeat sinking to the rhythm. You're no longer just watching this world. You're sinking into it, like ink into parchment. You're still trailing the scent of incense and aged sandalwood when the sound of quiet laughter draws you toward a private pavilion's smaller, warmer, less adorned than the others. This is no grand concert hall or poetry salon. This is where the magic happens in miniature, whispered stories, sly glances, and tea brewed just long enough to mean something. The performance tonight? Pure conversation. You settle in beside a low wooden table. Cushions invite you to sink in. Tea is already being poured jasmine, judging by the floral perfume rising from your cup. And seated across from you is a courtesan with sharp eyes and a calm smile. She's not here to dazzle you with music or calligraphy tonight. No. This is a battle of timing, of pauses, of tone. You've entered a social performance so subtle, it might as well be espionage in silk. And here's something you learn fast. In the pleasure quarters of ancient China, talking wasn't filler. It was the show. Especially in the Tang and Song periods, courtesans were trained to wield language like a musician plays notes strategically, elegantly, and with calculated emotional pitch. A single sentence could leave a patron entranced. For weeks, wondering what she meant when she said, "Your sleeves are longer than your regrets." Was that flirtation? A warning? Or just tea-induced philosophy? Historians still argue whether courtesans lead or merely mirrored the cultural taste of their eras, but either way, You feel the weight of it now. You're being pulled into a ritual of social exchange, equal parts seduction and strategy. And you're losing, not humiliatingly. Just artfully, the courtesan, across from you, asks a seemingly innocent question about the moon's reflection in your tea. You start to answer, then pause. Wait. Was that a reference to a famous poem? Or a metaphor for political instability? You're sweating now, which is ironic, given how slowly she's sipping her tea. Speaking of tea, here's a quirky detail. The way a courtesan handled the teapot was almost a form of sign language. Tilt the spout slightly left while pouring. She's being formal. Let the handle brush her sleeve. She's relaxed. Tap the rim of your cup once after receiving a pour. You're saying thank you without speaking. Do it twice. You're being too familiar. The tea dance was choreography in miniature. A musician begins to play softly in another room a slow guzheng tune that matches the pace of your conversation. You realize this too is by design. The tempo of music could signal how far into a visit you were, when to wrap up a flirtation, or when to drop a casual suggestion that perhaps you'd like to visit again. You take a bite of candied ginger. It's warm and sweet, a little sharp. Across from you, the courtesan smiles slightly, just a flicker. Barely a movement. Do you enjoy bitterness when it's wrapped in sugar? She asks. You blink. Are we talking about ginger, or your last relationship? This is not a game for the untrained. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for courtesans to rehearse conversations the way actors rehearse scenes. There were schools, sometimes informal, sometimes institutional, where young trainees would study tone, timing, and cultural references. There were drills in courtly etiquette, role-play dinners, and mock arguments. Because out here in the real pavilion, a slip of the tongue could mean offense to someone powerful, and apologies only worked if they came in poetic form. You glance down at your teacup and notice something written on the saucer in delicate ink. Just one character. Fund. It could mean change, or movement, or just breeze. You decide not to ask. It's probably the right choice. The courtesan begins to tell you a story about a scholar who once tried to impress her by reciting an entire Confucian treatise. He got to paragraph 4 before I asked if he wanted more tea, she says. He took that as a sign of affection. You both laugh softly. You suspect he still doesn't know. It's strange how unflinching the performance is, even in its quietest forms. These women weren't improvising. They were playing you, but with elegance. You never feel mocked. Just observed, engaged, and slowly, undeniably, softened. A scroll lies beside her, not for show. She asks if you'd like to try writing a line, just one. You pick up the brush. Your hands tremble slightly, and your ink bleeds too fast. She watches, doesn't laugh, just tilts her head and says, "That's what longing looks like in brush form." You want to believe she's being kind. Or maybe it's just true. Here's an odd historical tidbit. Some courtesans kept journals not of their own lives, but of conversations. Private logs of who said what, which phrases worked, which patrons preferred silence over wit. These logs weren't necessarily for gossip, they were learning tools. Imagine flipping through a diary filled with dialogue tags like, Minister Zhao responded well to bird metaphors, but disliked references to rain. Honestly, that's more organized than most modern dating apps. As the tea cools and the candle shortens, the courtesan leans slightly forward, her voice softer now. "Would you like to ask me a question?" she says. You nod. But what do you ask someone who already knows what you're about to say? You settle on something simple. Do you ever get tired of talking? She pauses for a long, long moment. I get tired of pretending it doesn't matter. You sit in silence after that. It's not awkward, just full. Outside, the moon has risen, slipping through the lattice window in fractured silver. The music has stopped. The breeze is cooler now. The conversation, your performance, is over. As you rise to leave, she bows slightly. You return the gesture, still unsure if you've impressed or simply amused. But you do know one thing. You will remember this hour more clearly than most state banquets. You're led down a narrower hallway now, the lanterns fewer, the voices softer, until you come to a wooden screen carved with cranes in flight. Behind it is a world almost no outsider sees. the training ground. Not for warriors or scholars, but for future courtesans. And tonight, you're the silent observer in the corner of a shadowy room, watching a generation being shaped in silk and silence. Here, there are no flirtatious glances or easy laughter. This is discipline, precision, and repetition so refined it borders on obsession. The courtesan curriculum was one of the most demanding forms of education in the ancient world, and you're about to see why. The youngest girls here are barely 8, though some start even earlier. They don't wear makeup or elaborate robes, yet just simple garments, hair pulled back tightly. Each one sits cross-legged in front of a guqin, or practices delicate brushstrokes on paper, the characters lined up like tiny soldiers. Their teachers pace behind them, correcting posture with the tap of a fan or a sharp glance. It's not cruel, but it is rigorous. Historians still argue whether these young girls were bought, adopted, or surrendered into this life. Some sources suggest desperate families viewed the courtesan houses as rare opportunities, social mobility wrapped in hardship. Others argue it was closer to indentured servitude and expensive clothing. The truth, like most things in history, probably floats somewhere in between. What's clear is this: being a courtesan was not about pleasure, it was about performance. And performance required mastery. One girl plays a zither phrase over and over soft, then softer, still until her teacher finally nods. Another girl balances a calligraphy brush on the back of her hand while reciting ancient poems aloud. Still another practices walking in a straight line with a book balanced on her head and a fan in her mouth. Why? To perfect poise, breath control, and silence. All at once, and that's just day one. You slip into the next room, where older trainees are rehearsing chess strategies, not for competition, but conversation. You see, Go and Shangji weren't just board games, they were symbolic. Playing well showed you could think critically, anticipate moves, mask intentions. All skills that, strangely enough, prepared you better for surviving the political minefield of elite company than any military drill. Like quirky tradition you might enjoy, courtesan schools often used fruit metaphors to describe personality types. A plum girl was sharp, witty, occasionally sour. A peach girl was warm, indulgent, prone to romantic distraction. A lotus girl, mysterious, poised, unreadable. Each girl was groomed into her assigned archetype, with training tailored to enhance those traits, not suppress them. And yet, every lesson was wrapped in paradox. Be alluring, but never too eager. Be intelligent, but never threatening. Be mysterious, but not unknowable. It's like walking a tightrope across a pond of political alligators, while smiling and quoting Confucius. The line between success and exile was thinner than a strand of hair. You sit quietly beside a small garden where the girls practice conversation drills. One pretends to be a tax inspector. Another responds as a poetic farmer's daughter. The goal, to shift tone, mid-discussion, without breaking rhythm. You listen, amazed, as the girl calmly turns a dialogue about grain, yields into a lament about the loss of spring. The instructor claps once. Success, you wonder, for a moment, if they even know what this life will ask of them. Maybe they do. Maybe it doesn't matter. Because here, inside these quiet walls, they're learning how to survive not just with grace, but with subtle power. Fun fact, some courtesan schools even offered sleep posture classes training young girls to nap elegantly, arms folded just so, hair pinned in a specific way, in case a guest arrived while they were resting. Apparently, waking up gracefully was a learned skill, not a coincidence. You begin to notice the little marks of status among the trainees. A jade comb here, a silk sash there. These weren't mere decorations, they were earned. A girl who mastered 10 Thames poems might receive an embroidered handkerchief. One who could recite Taoist parables while keeping rhythm with a bell might earn an extra hair ornament. Achievements weren't framed or posted, they were worn. One older girl notices you watching. She smiles, barely, then returns to her brushwork. Without a word, her hands move like wind over rice paper, each character as effortless as breathing. You realize she's writing not in Mandarin, but in New Shutha, secret women's script. Rare, fringe, and nearly lost to time. It was a code used among women to share private messages, hidden even from the men who lived under the same roof. That kind of quiet rebellion leaves you breathless. And then, the song changes. A teacher plucks a sharper note on the guqin. All the girls rise at once. It's time for etiquette practice. You watch as they file into a long room, each taking their position beside a lacquered screen. They bow in unison, walk in measured steps, place fans precisely, smile briefly, again and again and again, until they do it in their sleep. And maybe they will. Because in this life, sleep is just another performance, another opportunity to show control, grace, awareness, and if you're very, very lucky, perhaps affection. But affection is not the goal. The goal is mastery. You slip away before the final bell. Your footsteps muffled by thick carpets woven in cherry blossom motifs. Outside, the sun is just beginning to dim, casting golden light over the practice garden. And you wonder what it would take for any of them to escape this beautiful, gilded maze. You return just in time for dusk, when the walls of the pleasure quarter soften and the light begins to spill in golden streaks across paper screens. This time, you follow the sound of a man's voice, low, weary, the kind of voice that only appears when the weight of power becomes too heavy to carry alone. You slip through a narrow corridor and find yourself seated behind a paper-thin wall. No one knows you're here, but you can hear everything. This is where the true secrets are spoken, not in palace halls or on scrolls, but in hushed confessions shared with women trained to remember everything and reveal nothing. Tonight, you're listening to what's often left out of the history books, the role courtesans played not just in performance, but in listening. Not passively like a painted wall, but actively like a finely tuned mirror. You don't just pay them to look at you. You pay them to understand. You better than you understand yourself. The man behind the wall, judging by his size and syllables, has rank. He talks of political infighting, of a cousin with imperial ambitions, of documents mysteriously gone missing from the Ministry of Rights. But he doesn't speak plainly. He weaves it through metaphors, tangents, ancient parables, and the woman, seated with him, doesn't interrupt. She simply refills his wine with a tilt of the wrist and a silence that invites truth. Historians still debate whether courtesans intentionally gathered intelligence or merely absorbed it as occupational hazard. But either way, their proximity to power made them inadvertent archivists of empire. Ministers talked, princes vented, and courtesans listened, memorized, sometimes recorded, rarely forgot. One especially famous case involved a courtesan named Waylan, who reportedly overheard a general confess his plans to reroute troops away from the northern frontier. Rather than intervene directly, she commissioned a poem about absent winds along the border walls. The emperor's scholars read it. Alarm bells rang. Troops were rerouted. The rebellion fizzled before it began. True story. Maybe. But the tale lingered like incense faint. Hard to prove. Impossible to forget. You shift slightly on the cushion, still unseen, as the conversation continues. The man's voice grows slurred. The words tumble out now. He talks of regrets. A child he never visits. A favor he promised, someone now dead. The courtesan murmurs something too low for you to catch, but it makes him laugh, and then sigh, and then grow very quiet. Here's a quirky little detail. Many of the private rooms in elite pleasure houses had hollow walls, not for spying, but for acoustics. It made every confession feel more intimate, more resonant. A whisper would carry, just enough to feel significant. A sob would echo like a drumbeat. Architects called it emotional amplification. Courtesans called it job security. You slip away from the wall and into the hallway, where another room glows softly. Inside, a young courtesan is kneeling beside a scroll, carefully copying down characters, not poetry, not song lyrics, notes, fragments of conversations. You realize you're looking at a kind of diary, not of feelings, but of data. A log of who said what, when, with what inflection, and after how much wine. It's not espionage. It's memory insurance. And the most eerie part, the scroll is coded. The writing curves strangely, the grammar wrong. It's meant to be read aloud backward, like a whispered confession only another courtesan could understand. Some of these secret recordings would be passed down from teacher to pupil, part of the unofficial curriculum, a collection of human behaviors, complete with cautionary tales. Don't trust the one who overpays in advance. Watch how they treat servants. Always ask about their mother guilt. Makes the lips loose. You pause at a side table and see a fan. Resting there, inked along its folds, is a message written in the form of a couplet. He who fears his own name in the wind should not drink plum wine by the open door. You don't know who it's for, but someone will read it and understand. Fun fact, courtesans were sometimes hired specifically not to speak. Certain officials, especially those under surveillance, would pay just to sit with someone who wouldn't record or repeat a word. These women were prized for their ability to project presence without reaction, like human journals that could hold your secrets in the air between sentences. But silence didn't mean ignorance. You were beginning to realize that a greatest currency was awareness, of timing, of tone, of context. She might never repeat your words, but she would never forget them either. She might not quote you, but she could read the weather of your mood like a seasoned sailor tracking storm fronts. You watch another patron stumble out of a nearby room, eyes red, a half smile clinging to his face. He's lighter now, not because his burdens are gone, but because someone else helped carry them for a few hours, at least. And then, just beyond the veranda, you see a quiet scene, a courtesan seated alone, playing a goukin, not for an audience, just for herself. The notes are soft, uneven, thoughtful. She stops halfway through, leans her cheek against her hand, and exhales. You realize she's remembering something, or someone. Maybe even you, years from now, if you're lucky enough to be worth it. You walk on, wondering how many empires were held together by nothing more than the patient silence of women with powdered faces and perfect posture. And as the bells chime midnight, you understand. Here, behind paper walls, history wasn't written in ink. It was whispered, wept, and sealed in memory. You return just before dawn, when the courtyards are still cloaked in mist, and even the plum trees seem to sleep. The pleasure quarter is quiet, but not empty, ever truly empty. In a side room, lit by a single candle, a courtesan sits reading. Not a scroll of poetry, not a love letter. It's a slim book, its cover faded, the corners worn soft by repeated use. You draw closer and realize it's banned. That's right. Forbidden texts, subversive philosophy, poetry too politically bold or too erotically honest. This, it seems, is another of the courtesan's hidden talents, smuggling knowledge through shadows and soft voices tonight. You're discovering a less celebrated role courtesans played, not as lovers, not as artists, but as readers, and often as thinkers more educated than the men they entertained. Historians still argue whether courtesans had consistent access to elite education or learned in fragments passed secretly from scholar to scholar, but the evidence is tantalizing. Poems written in private hands, essays found among their possessions, corrections scribbled into the margins of books that, officially, women should never have touched. Courtesans, in many cases, were literate, rebels in embroidered sleeves. You step inside quietly and see the woman turn a page with her little finger lightly, like the paper might bruise. She's mouthing the words to herself, memorizing them not for performance, but preservation. It's a banned commentary on the Zhuangzi, a Taoist text known for its dreamy philosophy and slippery paradoxes. Apparently, this version was too skeptical, even for the late Thames censors. A quirky detail. Some pleasure houses maintain secret libraries, tucked behind screens or disguised as makeup chests. These collections included rare poetry, imported scrolls, and even philosophical texts smuggled from Korea or Japan. Books were often wrapped in silk, scented faintly with herbs to keep insects away, a kind of perfumed camouflage. A wise courtesan knew where the best verses were buried, and who could be trusted to hear them. And this knowledge, it wasn't ornamental. It was currency. You sit across from another courtesan, who's painting her nails not with lacquer, but with crushed flower petals mixed with alum. She looks up and asks, casually, "Do you think Zhuangzi's butterfly dream means life is an illusion?" You freeze. That's not the kind of question a concubine is supposed to ask. It's the kind that makes bureaucrats sweat and emperors suspicious. You fumble a vague reply about duality and transformation. She nods, not impressed, but amused. You've read only the surface, she says. He was laughing at the idea of truth altogether. Then she goes back to her nails. You start to suspect the courtesans aren't just reading these books, they're living them. In a society where female voices were often muffled by rules and rank, courtesans carved out intellectual sanctuaries behind closed doors. They debated, translated, and sometimes even rewrote the texts themselves. A few created their own commentaries, wrapped in poetry so dense it passed as mere entertainment. You remember hearing once that some emperors would secretly visit courtesans, not for pleasure, but for clarity. The imperial court was too full of flattery, the censors to close. But here, a woman with nothing to gain, and everything to observe, could offer something invaluable, unfiltered thought. One famous anecdote, probably, embroidered over of a Song dynasty courtesan named Zhu Qing who, upon reading a Confucian tract on filial piety, declared it too neat for real families. She then composed a poem mocking the idea of blind obedience to parents, using metaphors of birds that forget how to fly. That poem, circulated in whispered copies across 3 provinces, before the censors burned every trace of it, or tried to. You turn a corner and enter another study, this one lit by slanted morning light. A young courtesan is being tested by her instructor, not in posture or dance, but in rhetoric. She's asked to argue whether human nature is fundamentally good. Her reply, "We are born with potential, not a path." It's simple, but sharp. Her teacher nods once. Fun fact, some courtesans kept personal philosophical scrapbooks. These weren't diaries of emotion or gossip, but collections of quotes, questions, arguments. One might note, customer prefers Mencius, pretends not to know Mozi. Another might copy a line of Buddhist scripture next to a complaint about tea temperature. These pages were a blend of real life and spiritual inquiry, part lampoon, part longing. You find one tucked beneath a writing desk. On the first page is a line that stops you cold. A man may conquer a kingdom, yet still fear a woman who asks too many questions. You close the book gently. You understand. As the sun rises higher, the courtyard begins to stir. Musicians warm up. Perfume is reheated in clay dishes, but the atmosphere is still hushed, as if last night's thoughts are still steeping in the air like strong tea. You pass one final room, where 2 courtesans are arguing softly over a passage from Laozi. One says the Tao is surrender. The other insists it's rebellion. They break off laughing, then fall into silence, watching the shadows on the floor shift with the wind. Neither will win, and neither needs to. And you leave with your mind humming, not with flirtation or fantasy, but with ideas, carried not by scholars in robes, but by women who were never supposed to speak them aloud. This time, you arrive not through a garden path or a scented hall, but through the back entrance of a pavilion barely lit and far from the music. It's quiet here, quiet, in that specific way, where silence doesn't mean peace, but calculation. You're in the part of the courtesan's world people prefer not to think about. The part that smells faintly of ledger ink, damp wood, and perfume gone sour. This is where everything that looks effortless gets made. Tonight, you're about to meet the women who don't perform under lantern light, but who control everything behind it. Yes, we're talking about the madams. Not all courtesans worked under a matron. Some rented their own rooms, operated independently, or partnered in quiet alliances with wealthier peers. But for many, particularly in the early stages of their careers, there was a woman behind the curtain, a manager, mentor, gatekeeper, and let's be honest, broker. You slip into a narrow study lined with scrolls and lacquer boxes. A woman in her late 50s is bent over a balance sheet, dipping her brush in thick black ink. Her hair is silvered, her silk robe worn soft with time. She doesn't look up, she doesn't need to. She already knows you're there. "Tea?" she asks, without waiting for a reply. You nod instinctively. She pours. Madams weren't always retired courtesans. Sometimes they were widows with clever instincts and good connections. Sometimes they were former maids who rose through the ranks by sheer observation. And yes, sometimes they were once stars themselves, now dimmed by time, but no less formidable. If a courtesan was a firework, the madam was the match, the sky, and the entire fire code. Historians still debate whether madams protected or exploited the women in their care. There are arguments for both. Some were ruthless businesswomen who saw their girls as assets, replaceable and expendable. Others ran their houses like sorority covens, fierce in protection, loyal for life. The real answer probably depends on the nighthand, the client. A quirky truth: elite madams kept ledgers as detailed as any imperial scribes. Not just earnings and debts, but mood logs, notes on clients' preferences, court gossip, who was behind on tea payments, who had recently wept in a robe closet after a bad poem recital. One even categorized her girls by flower types and assigned patrons accordingly. Chrysanthemums went to scholars, peonies to military men. Lotus girls were reserved for those who cried at poetry. The woman across from you finally looks up. Her eyes are sharp, assessing. "You're not here for pleasure," she says. "You're here for the gears." She's right. She begins to speak not as a storyteller, but as a strategist. "A good courtesan," she says, "can make a man weep. A great one can make him pay before he weeps. But the best ones, they leave him wondering whether he ever deserved the tears." You smile. She doesn't. Behind her is a wall of silk pouches, each labeled in fine calligraphy, not coin contracts. Courtesans didn't just offer a night of entertainment. They offered subscriptions, loyalty pledges, long-term arrangements that blurred the line between romance and patronage. A governor might pay monthly, just for the possibility of access. The madam kept the details precise. Miss a payment, get a colder reception, demand more than agreed upon. Find yourself suddenly scheduled opposite your least favorite rival. She shows you a scroll with neat annotations. Client no, 17, overconfident, allergic to plum wine, responds well to flattery via metaphor, but dislikes being compared to deities. That's not a personality profile. That's battle prep. Fun fact: some madams kept deception rosters. These weren't about tricking clients. They were internal memos for courtesans to know when and how to slightly misremember certain things. A powerful man might believe he told a secret to one courtesan, but it had been shared with another. This way, secrets didn't walk out the door so easily. Memory became a tool of containment. You notice a bell on the desk. Small, plain, and perfectly centered. "That's for emergencies," she says. "Not fire, dignity." She tells you the story of a young courtesan who, years ago, was cornered by an official demanding a refund of affection. She rang the bell, to guards yet. Guards appeared from a hidden stairwell. The official left with bruised pride and a very faint wine stain. She smiles faintly. The guards were former clients, loyal ones. You blink. Of course they were. You ask her what she fears most. She doesn't hesitate. Boredom, she says. A bored girl makes bad decisions. A bored client starts believing he's clever. Then she returns to her ledgers. Some madams had entire rotation schedules, designed not to prevent fatigue, but to maintain novelty. Courtesans were rarely paired with the same patron too often. Familiarity might breed affection or contempt. Better to let longing build between encounters. Let the music of absence deepen the tone. You wander into a side room where silks are being dyed. A younger assistant explains that certain colors are reserved for certain moods: crimson, rebirth, indigo, reflection, gold-threaded black, ambiguity. Even textiles became part of the emotional manipulation. That robe you liked so much, it was chosen for you 2 weeks in advance, based on a comment you made about thunderstorms. You exit the dye room and nearly bump into a noble, clearly impatient. He's here for a scheduled visit. The madam appears behind you, all smiles now. She greets him with a warmth you didn't see in the ledger room. But when she glances at you behind his back, her expression shifts just for a second. Cold, precise, knowing you leave through the same back door you entered. Stepping once more into morning mist. And now you understand. The madams weren't keeping the place running. They were the ones writing the real script. It's evening again. and you're slipping through the edges of the pleasure quarter, just as the lanterns start to bloom across the rooftops like silent fireflies. The air hums with the low thrum of a pipa being tuned, and the laughter of unseen voices drifts on the breeze like the scent of roasted chestnuts. But tonight, your footsteps don't carry you toward conversation or ceremony. They take you somewhere, stranger somewhere. The boundary between fantasy and performance wears dangerously thin. Tonight, you're witnessing the illusions, the masked art of emotional theater courtesans conjured for those who didn't want company. But escape this was not the flirtatious banter of early evening, nor the gentle philosophical sparring of midnight tea. This was something else. Here, in curtained chambers lit only by amber lamplight, courtesans slipped into characters not to hide, but to reveal. If you thought role-play was a modern invention, think again. As you duck beneath a painted silk curtain, you're greeted not by a name, but a story. The courtesan here wears a costume from the Han Dynasty and addresses you as if you were a war hero just returned from the frontier. You blink, unsure. She doesn't break character. She pours your wine with reverence, not flirtation, and begins to tell you of how the empire trembled while you were away. And just like that, you're not yourself anymore either. Historians still argue whether this kind of immersive, identity performance was simply clever entertainment, or something deeper, early forms of emotional therapy. Maybe even a spiritual salve for lives that were unbearably constrained. But whether calculated or cathartic, it worked. For the span of a few hours, you became someone else, someone worth mourning, admiring, listening to. A quirky footnote in a Minera journal describes a courtesan who performed nightly as a widow in mourning black robes. Face unpainted, voice low with grief. Men lined up to grieve with her. Some came just to apologize, not for anything they'd done, but for things they hadn't been brave enough to feel. Grief, it turned out, was a kind of romance. Another courtesan made herself into a dream guide. Clients entered her room through a curtain of bells and lay down on embroidered mats as she whispered to them in riddles. She'd recount a dream they hadn't had yet end when they returned a month later. Swearing it had come true, she would only smile and say, "I warned you about the plum blossoms." You pass through another chamber now, this one styled as a Taoist hermit's retreat. The courtesan before you wears plain robes, no makeup, hair pinned with nothing more than a twig. She speaks in aphorisms, offers you silence more than answers, and serves bitter tea that leaves your tongue numb. She never flirts, she simply watches, and you feel more exposed under her calm stare than you ever did beneath 1,000 compliments. This is emotional theater at its most sophisticated. There are no scripts, just archetypes. No climax, just resonance. Courtesans here were not selling pleasure. They were selling narrative. Your fears, your regrets, your secret wishes. They became set pieces. And the woman before you, painted or plain, smiling or weeping, was both mirror and muse. One of the more surreal scenes you wander into is the reunion room. Everything is soft, here pale blue curtains, the scent of violet and rice starch in the air. A courtesan greets you as if you are her long-lost lover. She doesn't demand your name, she gives you hers, a name soaked in longing. She tells you where you met, how you left, what she never got to say. Her voice trembles, not with artifice, but with uncanny truth. It's scripted, sure, but also, devastating. Clients cried in here, laughed. Some came every month, pretending to be the same ghost from a different war. Others came to say goodbye to people who never existed. And sometimes courtesans broke character on purpose. Not to destroy the illusion, but to deepen it. One minute she's playing the grieving widow. The next, she pauses, looks you in the eye, and says, "You don't look like you believe me tonight." That crack in the facade. That's where the story enters your bloodstream. Fun fact. In some houses, courtesans had access to small wardrobes filled with borrowed identities. A tattered peasant's robe, a general's lost scarf, a child's rattle, wrapped in silk. Each object had a tale. When a client pointed to one, the performance would begin. It was like choosing your own emotional fate, complete with costume. You step outside for a moment to breathe. The air is still warm. You hear soft laughter near Benot. forced, not rehearsed. It belongs to a courtesan off-duty, talking to another in a mix of slang and old poetry. Even off-stage, the world is a blur of fact and fiction, and you realize no one here is exactly who they seem. Not the courtesans, not the clients, not even you. The whole pleasure quarter is a kind of shared hallucination, a choose-your-own heartache, adventure. An emotional labyrinth, where each room promises transformation, not through truth, but through believable lies. As you leave, a woman whispers as you pass, "You'll return as someone else." It's unclear whether she means tomorrow, next season, or in your next life. But either way, she's probably right. Tonight, you're walking slower. The lanterns have dimmed, the laughter is thinner, and the scent of sweet wine in the air is fading into something more melancholy, burned sandalwood. Drying ink, silk left in the sun a bit too long. You've wandered deep enough into the pleasure quarter now to feel its edges. This is where the glamour softens and reveals the scaffolding underneath here. In the quieter corners is where the truth of aging courtesans begins to unfold. You pass a courtyard where a woman sits combing her hair. It's streaked with gray, though not all at once. Silver at the temples, a faint paleness beneath the lacquered black. Her movements are slow, deliberate, not tired, practiced. She knows every tug of that comb is a performance in itself. No audience, just memory. Aging in the courtesan world was inevitable, but not uncomplicated. Some women bowed out early, securing a wealthy patron to sponsor their quiet retirement. Others rose into management, becoming madams, like the one you met before, keepers of ledgers and secrets. But some remained on stage, not in defiance, not in desperation, but because their presence still commanded a room. Historians still argue whether older courtesans were marginalized or elevated. Some records suggest they were eclipsed by younger, fresher faces, while others hint at a reverence or recognition of their skill, their poise, the impossible subtlety of a woman who didn't need beauty to hold your gaze. You pass into a salon where one such woman is reciting poetry. Her voice is raspy, worn soft by decades of speaking with intention. She wears no makeup. Her robe is plain, but the men around her are utterly silent, hanging on every pause. She doesn't rush. She controls time with each syllable. That's something youth can't buy. Gravity, a quirky detail. In some high-end pleasure houses, elder courtesans were referred to not by name, but by metaphor, the winter lotus, the second moon, or simply, she who remembers. These weren't euphemisms, they were honors. Because in a place driven by illusions, memory was a rare and terrifying form of power, and with memory came stories. Not just anecdotes or gossip, but cautionary tales, oral histories, the long view. The winter lotus remembers when a prince came in weeping, and left with a poem etched into his sleeve. She remembers the season plum wine was poisoned. She remembers which courtesan faked a fainting spell so convincingly it triggered a palace reform. She remembers everything. You sit down beside one of these women in a smaller, older pavilion, and she smiles at you, not with seduction, but recognition. "New?" she asks. You nod. She doesn't press. She begins to peel a tangerine, the rind curling neatly into a single spiral. "Most don't ask about the ending," she says. "They only want the entrance, the bloom, the applause. And yet here you are, sitting with the encore." She tells you of younger girls who burn fast and bright. Fireflies in oil, she calls them, beautiful. Brief, gone, but the smart ones, she adds, biting into a tangerine slice. They slow down. Learn to make silence interesting. One fun fact, elder courtesans often taught exit rituals to the younger generation, how to bow just so after a final poem, how to leave a room without being followed, how to plant a farewell phrase that would echo in a client's memory for weeks. You don't just vanish. You orchestrate your departure, like a final movement in a symphony. You listen as she recounts her own ritual. A candle that burns out exactly 4 minutes after she leaves. Timing, she says. That's how you become a memory, not a regret. But not all aged courtesans were fortunate. You hear whispers, always whispers, of women who lost patrons too soon, who aged out of demand before they could transition into mentorship or management. Some vanished into marriage, welcomed by merchants or low-ranking scholars who wanted elegance at home. Others disappeared into the city, selling herbal medicines, teaching music, or simply fading. And then there were the anonymous ones, the shadows. Women who passed through this world so quietly, their stories were never recorded. No poems, no scrolls, just the ripple of a tea bowl placed too softly on a lacquered tray. The courtesan beside you leans closer. "We talk about beauty," she says, "but what they pay for, what they need is presence. You give them something that doesn't belong to them, time, attention, a version of themselves they like." She pauses, looks at your teacup, and then she continues. "You teach them how to miss it." It's a chilling truth, delivered with warmth, and suddenly you understand. Aging, in this world, wasn't always a decline. Sometimes it was a transformation, from flame to ember, from mirror to ghost, from performance to presence. You follow her into a small studio where she's teaching to young courtesans how to walk slowly, not gracefully, not seductively, just ... Intentionally. "Let your steps fall like drops on paper," she says. "Let silence collect around them." One girl giggles. The other stumbles. She sighs, but smiles. "We'll try again tomorrow." And isn't that the real legacy? Not the fame, not the poems, but the transfer of attention, of grace under pressure, of dignity in diminishing light. You rise to leave, and she gives you a nod, a goodbye, but a gentle dismissal, like a bell being rung at the end of a lesson. You return to the main corridor, feeling older yourself, somehow, like the night has folded in on you and left something heavier behind. Outside, the moon is high. The petals on the plum tree have curled, and somewhere in the distance, a zither plays in a key that only age can fully appreciate. You step away from the older courtesans and drift deeper into the city's pulse, where the pleasure quarters' glowing lanterns fade into the rougher edge of town. It's quieter here, but not gentler. The laughter you hear now is sharper, and the fragrance that lingers in the air is less jasmine and more wood smoke and dust. You're heading into a shadowed annex of the courtesan world that few like to acknowledge, the imitation houses. Yes, imitation courtesans, lesser known, often untrained, frequently overworked and still a vital part of the economic ecosystem, orbiting the glittering elite. You're about to meet the forgotten sisters in this hierarchy, the ones who mimicked the grace without the training, who borrowed the language but not the silk. These weren't the courtesans who served emperors, or recited obscure Tang poems. These were the ones who operated out of back alleys, moonlighting under the names of women they'd never meet. They wore the idea of elegance like a borrowed robe-stiff in places, too short in others, but it worked. At least for men who couldn't afford the real thing. Historians still debate whether these imitation houses offered a stepping stone for social mobility, or whether they were simply a mirror for the desperation of the lower classes. Some women moved upward, plucked from obscurity by patrons, or recognized for their raw talents. Others stayed here forever, caught in the orbit of a system designed never to fully see them. You pass a low-slung building whose paint is peeling, in long strips. Inside, the air smells of cheap perfume and boiled rice. A girl, barely in her teens, is practicing a song with a cracked lute. Her vowels are off, her fingers unsure, but her eyes, sharp, focused. She knows the only way out is through, and she's watching the doorway like it might open to her chance. One quirky detail about these imitation houses: they often decorated with copies of famous poems and artwork, but wrong on purpose. One character changed here, one stroke smudged. There, it was just enough to imply sophistication, without triggering a copyright dispute or attracting attacks. You might see a fan painted with a poem on the river during spring, but it's been altered to mention dumplings instead of orchids. Close enough, they'd say. The women here didn't learn Confucian classics. They learned timing, how to pour wine without sloshing, how to hold a man's attention just long enough to earn another coin. They weren't trained in calligraphy, but in flattery, not in zither technique, but in listening hard and responding faster. And yet, despite the lowered expectations, these imitation courtesans weren't devoid of grace. You find one writing her own verses with a stolen brush. They're clumsy, sure, but sincere. She's writing to no one. Or maybe, to the version of herself she hopes still exists. She notices you and grins. I'm the discount version, she jokes. Still warm, slightly dented. Her laugh is full-bodied and bitter. Then she adds, quieter, but I remember every word of the real girl's poems, and she does. She recites one to Yuzum by Li Qingzhao, though misquoted, and you feel your throat tighten. She isn't a scholar, but she feels it, and sometimes that's more than enough. Fun fact, imitation houses sometimes staged elaborate parodies of elite courtesan routines. Entire evenings were devoted to farsa, satire of the elegant salons, with mock etiquette, exaggerated poetry, and invented philosophical debates. Patrons loved it. It was half rebellion, half admiration. Even some real courtesans snuck in to laugh at themselves, or to borrow material. You step into a back room where two women are sewing their own dresses. No tailors here. One is patching frayed silk with dyed thread, carefully recreating a lotus motif that might pass as authentic if you squint. The other is adjusting a pair of slippers, stuffing the toes with paper so they appear more dainty. It's survival by illusion, artistry in desperation. Do they talk about us in the scrolls? One asks. You shake your head. They don't. Not really. Good, she says. Let them dream. Yet some imitation courtesans did rise. One legend tells of a woman named Feyarui, who began in a shadowy tea house, imitating the songs of a famous courtesan she'd never seen. Word spread that her voice could crack stone. A minor official heard her one night, recognized the depth behind her mimicry, and sponsored her move into a mid-tier house. She eventually joined the elite circuit, but she never stopped singing. The imitation songs said they were more honest. You move toward the rear courtyard, where a few women are gathered around a pot of millet porridge. They're not performing. They're resting. One massages her own aching wrist. Another braids her hair with fingers still stained from cheap rouge. They talk about shoes, about debt, about a client who cried because he saw his mother in her eyes. It's not glamorous, but it's real. And the truth is, some men preferred these houses. Not because they were cheaper, but because they were simpler. There was less performance, less illusion here. The masks were thinner, and sometimes dropped altogether. You could laugh without rhythm, drink without ritual, mourn without poetry. As you leave, one of the women waves you off. Tell them we weren't as pretty, she says, but we were better liars. She winks, then turns back to her porridge. You walk away slowly, your shoes crunching on gravel. The pleasure quarter may be built on silk and reputation, but its reflection, out here in the dust, has a kind of clarity the palace walls will never admit. And somewhere between the painted illusion and the cracked mirror, the truth waits, aching, unrecorded. You return to the pleasure quarter, with the weight of the imitation houses still clinging to your thoughts. Tonight, though, the streets are quieter. The usual hum has softened, and the scent of osmanthus and ink is barely present. Something feels different. It's not festival night, nor a storm approaching. No, this is the quiet that settles when everyone is watching something. Or rather, someone. You follow the hush through winding halls and polished screens until you arrive at a private salon. Inside, the lighting is minimal, just one paper lantern glowing like a peach in the corner. All attention is focused on a single figure, a courtesan in the act of reinvention. This is not her debut. You've seen her before, but never like this. Her voice is lower. Her robe is blue tonight, not crimson. She speaks more slowly, like time is bending around her. She has changed, subtly, but completely. And the audience leans in, because they don't know if they're watching a performance or a rebirth. Tonight you're witnessing the phenomenon of rebranding, how courtesans shaped, shifted, and sometimes shed their identities, like silk robes, slipping to the floor. Because to survive here, especially at the upper levels, you couldn't stay one thing for too long. Mystery ages better than fame. Historians still argue whether this fluidity was a form of empowerment or simply a market adaptation. Did courtesans reinvent themselves to explore agency, or Because men grew bored too easily? Probably both. Either way, the result was the same. Control through transformation. A fun detail. Some elite courtesans kept multiple names, each attached to a different persona. Lotus Moon was quiet and wistful. Lady Wu was bold, argumentative. Snow Petal was tragic, always veiled in white and never smiled. The same woman, different masks, different pricing tiers. You sit near the edge of the room, as she lets call her, Snow Petal, for now reaches the climax of a story. It's not about her, but it is. A woman who wandered into the woods and emerged with white hair and no memory, except for a song she couldn't stop singing. It's haunting. The room holds its breath. You realize the story is her reintroduction. She's dissolving her past, Lotus Moon. The playful darling of last summer, inviting the audience to fall for someone else entirely. You see it work, moment by moment. A scholar at the front tilts his head like he's trying to figure out when she changed. A merchant murmurs, wasn't she taller? She wasn't. But now, in this guise, she might as well be. You watch her move through the room afterward. She doesn't walk differently, but everything feels different. Where she once giggled, she now pauses. Where she once poured wine, she lets it sit until someone asks for it. She has changed her pacing, her weight, her emotional gravity, and it's working. This wasn't always a solo project. In larger houses, rebranding was managed like relaunching a product. The madams and assistants would create backstories, compose new poems, craft new styles of calligraphy. One girl even faked a 3-year absence by hiding behind screens for a month, then returning as a mysterious visitor from the south with an invented dialect, of course. Some reinventions failed. One courtesan tried to rebrand herself as the widow of the lost admiral. But when a real admiral's family sued, she had to flee to Hangzhou and start over as mist behind bamboo. It wasn't just about acting. Courtesans learned how to erase their prior personas. They'd burn old love letters in front of clients, refuse to speak of certain past performances, even switch dominant hands when writing poetry to disguise their script. Reinvention required forgetting not just by the audience, but by the self. You meet one such woman in a quiet alcove. She's adjusting a hairpin in the mirror, and you ask, carefully, weren't you once called? She cuts you off with a smile. No, she died. Then she turns and walks away, her sleeves trailing behind like smoke from an extinguished lamp. Another woman teaches you a subtle trick. If they call you by the wrong name, correct them but softer each time. Eventually, they'll wonder if they made it up. It's psychological acupuncture. A game of small wounds and long healing. And some rebrandings weren't artistic, they were strategic. One courtesan returned from a season away with a limp. Rather than hide it, she incorporated it. Created a persona named Autumn Stagger, said to have emerged from a fall in a haunted temple. Men loved her, claimed she reminded them of past mistakes and future repentance. She made more in 6 months than she had in 2 years prior. Another took up calligraphy, using her non-dominant hand, and claimed she had forgotten how to write due to heartbreak. Clients wept. One scholar returned weekly just to help her remember, by reading her old poems aloud. And then there were courtesans who changed, not because they had to, but because they could. They got bored. Curious. They wanted to test how many versions of themselves could be loved. There's always another name, one tells you. Another poem. Another way to be unforgettable. You walk away from Snow Petal's salon just as she blows out the final lantern. Her silhouette is visible against the Shoshi screen. Tomorrow, she might be someone new. But for now, she's a woman in transition. Halfway between artifice and truth. And that's what makes her so dangerous. In this world, survival isn't about staying real. It's about staying interesting. Reinvention is the highest form of self-defense. The hour is late, now almost liminal. The laughter from earlier has dissolved into silence, and even the cicadas seem to hesitate before chirping. You find yourself back in the main courtyard, where the stone tiles are still warm from the day. A paper lantern swings gently overhead, casting soft shadows in the shape of plum blossoms across your path. But there's something in the air, a shift, a stillness. Tonight, you're not here to watch a performance. or uncover another role. You're here for what they leave behind. The world of the courtesan didn't end with her departure. In fact, some of their most lasting influence began after they were gone from the stage, the city, or even the world. Tonight, you're learning about the legacy courtesans left behind, not just in history, but in memory, literature, art, and imitation. There's a small back room behind the study house. You wouldn't notice it unless someone showed you. It's filled with objects: fans, robes, inkstones, hairpins. Each one is tag-noted with a price, but a story. Used in the farewell banquet of Snowpetal, worn during the last performance of Peach Whisper. These are not museum pieces. They are emotional fossils, and they matter. Historians still argue whether the legendary status of certain courtesans was built on fact or romanticized by later poets and dramatists. Did they really say the things attributed to them, or did the men who loved and lost them invent better versions for posterity? There's truth buried somewhere in the silk, but like all memory, it's filtered through longing. A fun, bittersweet detail. Entire anthologies of poetry were compiled by men grieving their favorite courtesans. One even published a scroll titled Verses from Her Mirror, containing poems he claimed she whispered to her reflection. We have no idea if any of it was true, but it sold well. Still does, actually. You sit beside a lacquered chest and pull out a scroll. It's unsigned, written in an untrained but delicate hand. It reads, "They said I made the moon blush, but he never came back to look at it with me." It hits harder than most famous couplets. The influence of courtesans wasn't just personal, it was aesthetic. Their fashions set citywide trends. Their calligraphy got copied by aristocratic daughters trying to add flavor to their brushwork. Courtesan slang made its way into popular plays, and then into the speech of entire districts. A well-turned phrase from a clever courtesan could become a proverb in a decade. To dance on silk shoes during monsoon. Originally a metaphor for risking. Heartbreak was coined by a courtesan in Nanjing, whose lovers had a habit of dying in odd weather. You find a painting rolled up on a shelf, faded, but still vibrant. It shows a woman pouring tea from an impossible height, the stream unbroken as it arcs into the cup below. You've heard of this painting, The Pour of Separation, a tribute to a courtesan who could measure time by tea alone. When her favorite scholar failed to return on the agreed night, she poured his tea anyway. Then again the next night, and the next. She died of fever before he arrived. Now, women imitate her tea pour. At farewell ceremonies, less for love, more for art. Some legacies were practical. One retired courtesan started a private school for girls on paper. It taught embroidery, but everyone knew the real curriculum was how to think while smiling. Another became a ghostwriter for male poets who couldn't meet deadlines. Her verses were published under 7 different names, all male. Some are still quoted on temple walls today, but other legacies were more intangible. You speak with an old attendant, now nearly blind, who recalls a courtesan named Silk Tongue. She made people feel brave, he says, as if it were the highest praise. They told her things, and then they walked straighter. There's no monument for Silk Tongue. Just a hairpin she left behind, shaped like a willow branch, resting in a drawer beside some sandalwood beads. Yet somehow, she remains unforgettable. In another wing, you find a small shrine. Not religious, personal, candles, poems, gifts left by patrons long gone. It's devoted to a courtesan named Hui Yuan, who never married, never retired, and never accepted a long-term patron. She was known for her eyes, like watching a storm from a safe porch. One man wrote. She died suddenly. No one claimed her body, but within a week, 5 different clients had carved her name into different bridges across the city. Now there's a saying, you're walking Hui Yuan's path, meaning you've fallen in love with a ghost. Some legacies, courtesans, did claim for themselves. They left final poems etched into their walls. They trained protégés. They dictated letters not to lovers, but to history. One even wrote her own biography, part fact, part fiction, all power. It ends with the line, "They'll remember my silhouette longer than his laws." Cold, accurate. You realize something now, sitting in the low light of the legacy room. These women were never meant to last. They were designed to be moments, flickers, impressions, poems folded into memory, but they endured anyway. Not because history welcomed them, but because they refused to be forgotten. One last scroll catches your eye. It simply says, "She gave no heir, but many daughters." And you know what that means. Not blood daughters, style daughters, imitators, protégés, women who heard a verse and thought, "I can speak like that too." Her legacy was not her body, it was her voice. As you leave the room, the lantern finally burns out behind you, but her words linger. Because in the end, legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what people still quote in the dark. It's nearly morning now, but the sky hasn't decided whether to lighten or linger. You're still inside the pleasure quarter, though it feels more like a memory than a place now quiet, echoing, timeless. The lanterns are out. The floors are cool, and somewhere behind a folding screen, someone exhales in their sleep. Tonight has been about people, the women who sang, wrote, wept, and vanished. But here, in this final stretch of the night, we shift focus to the architecture of the courtesan world, not the metaphorical kind, the actual buildings. Because the structures that housed all of this complexity were more than just pretty backdrops. They were part of the performance. You begin in the main salon of a high-end house. The room is deceptively simple. Polished wood floors, painted screens, a few mats for sitting. But look closer, and you'll see the design, intentional, layered, full of cues and codes. Doors placed to frame the perfect entrance. Skylights that diffuse moonlight just enough to create that glow. Courtesans favored. Hidden panels that let sound travel but only in one direction. Historians still debate how much of these layouts were functional versus theatrical. Were courtyards designed for airflow or for eavesdropping? Were upper balconies architectural choices or symbolic ones meant to echo the social heights courtesans were meant to simulate, but never fully reach? A fun detail. Some of these houses used sloped floorboards that subtly guided the flow of foot traffic toward particular rooms. Not so noticeable that you'd trip but enough to make the curious drift naturally toward where the action was. It's hospitality by architecture. A bit manipulative, maybe, but elegant. There's a courtyard you visit next. Low stone walls, a koi pond, bamboo in neat clusters. A single bench sits beneath a plum tree. This is where courtesans rested between performances, or met clients away from the crowd. But again, notice the design. The plum tree isn't just pretty, it's a calendar. Plum blossoms in late winter. Meetings held here always carried extra symbolism, endurance, awakening hope. You pass into a corridor lined with mirrors, not silvered, but polished bronze. They're cloudy, a little distorted, but they weren't for vanity. These mirrors made everything a little more dreamlike. Courtesans checked their angles here before a performance. Clients caught glimpses of themselves mid-conversation. Reflections were part of the illusion. If you saw yourself looking happy, maybe you'd feel it. And then there were the thresholds. Doorways were crucial in courtesan houses. Low frames forced visitors to bow slightly as they entered, whether they meant to or not. A subtle reminder. This was her domain, her tempo. Even if you outranked her in the world beyond these walls, here, you played by her rules. One building you explore has narrow staircases, designed so only one person can walk at a time. Courtesans always went first. Clients followed. A visual hierarchy enforced by bricks and wood. In some elite salons, the floorboards were hollowed beneath key areas not to hide things, but to carry sound. A whispered compliment in one room might be heard faintly in another, not clear enough to repeat, just clear enough to create intrigue, as if every compliment had an audience, as if every word could matter. And of course there were the private rooms. These were never bedrooms, not exactly. They were curated environments. Each one had its own theme, its own lighting system, its own rules. You visit one styled as a fish hut, trough walls, nets hanging, a lantern shaped like a boat. Another is a scholar's den filled with scrolls, fake ink stains, and the scent of burning cedar. Clients didn't just visit these rooms. They stepped into them, became part of the fiction. Each room was a new world, and the courtesans, they were the only ones who knew the exits. A particularly eerie feature you come across is the scent corridor. You walk through it almost by accident. It's lined with faint fragrances, asmanthus at first, then sandalwood, then something you can't name. Each scent change corresponds to a turn in the hallway, so subtle you wouldn't notice unless you were paying close attention. But courtesans noticed, and used it. If he smells jasmine, one once said, he'll remember her laughter. It was Pavlovian poetry. Some courtesan houses had secret gardens on their rooftops, tiny ones, just a patch of moss and a few stones. Hidden spaces where women went to scream, to write, to not perform. These weren't part of the public tour. They weren't even shared between courtesans. Personal refuges, in a world built for everyone but them. You enter one such space now. It's silent. A half-burned incense stick still lingers. A water basin reflects the sky, just barely starting to gray with dawn. A low wooden box holds folded slips of paper. You're not supposed to read them. But one falls open. It simply says, "He thought the echo was me." You return to the courtyard. The architecture of the courtesan world wasn't just about beauty, it was about control. Every beam, every cushion, every fan placed just so, wasn't passive decor. It was an active participant in the story, like a silent actor on stage, helping the women control tempo, attention, mood. If the courtesan was a composer, then the house was her orchestra, and when she was gone, the space remembered. That's the strange thing about these rooms. They held memory, not the kind etched into scrolls, but the kind that lives in grooves in the floor, scratches on a doorframe, a faint perfume clinging to silk wallpaper. Memory without words. You sit in the salon again. The morning light is now pouring in, soft and golden. It touches the floor where she used to kneel, highlights the grain in the wood. You imagine her there, not a name, not a costume, just a woman, in her own space, controlling it all, and even though you're alone, you feel watched, not in a frightening way, in a knowing way, as if the house, somehow, remembers everything she taught it. The morning creeps in at last, soft, unspectacular. Not a dramatic sunrise, not a chorus of birds, just a slow graying of the sky, and a quiet that settles in like dust over polished wood. You're still here, still wandering this quarter of smoke and memory, but something's changed. Not outside. In you, you're moving slower now, not because you're tired, though you are, but because you've begun to realize that in this world, nothing is hurried. Time is drawn out like silk from a cocoon. Pain is diluted with poetry. Even love, so often fleeting, is fermented here, until it becomes something darker, something drinkable. Tonight, well, this morning you arrive at your final stop. But it's not a performance, not a salon, not even a conversation. You find yourself at the edge of a narrow canal, behind the pleasure quarter, where the walls lean slightly inward, like they've been listening too long. A bamboo pier juts into the water, and beside it, a long wooden boat, low and flat, barely above the waterline. It's not for passengers, it's for departures, not the poetic kind, the real kind. This is where courtesans left the quarter. Quietly, permanently, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. It's a place rarely mentioned in scrolls or poems. But you found it. And it waits. This final section is about farewells, not the ones crafted with lanterns and tears, but the ones no one wanted to talk about. The endings that came without applause. Historians still argue whether most courtesans retired in comfort, in marriage, or in silence. Records are scarce, and most were written by men with agendas. But the truth is probably messier. Some married wealthy patrons and lived quietly in the hills. Some opened tea houses. Some vanished into temples, and some simply disappeared. A fun and chilling detail in some cities. Courtesans left behind ghost poems, short verses scribbled onto fans, hair ribbons, or lanterns, and tucked into alleyways, or slipped into the hands of a favorite attendant. No names, just a few words, like emotional graffiti. One such poem, still preserved, reads, "I smiled too long. The mask forgot to let go." You walk the edge of the canal, where faded prayer flags ripple in the light breeze. You notice something odd, small stones, smoothed by the river, arranged, in spirals and half circles. They're not decorative. They're markers. Courtesans who left at night sometimes placed them as silent farewells. Each pattern meant something. A circle, marriage, a triangle, illness, a broken line, exile. You kneel and trace one with your finger. It's a square missing one side. You're not sure what it means. Maybe no one is. Nearby, a weathered man tends to the boats. He doesn't speak, but he hums. A tune too old to name. He helps with the quiet departures. He's seen them, all the veiled woman clutching a travel pack. The one with bruises she hid beneath jade powder. The one who laughed, too loud, too long, and stopped suddenly. He says nothing, just helps them board. And once they go, no one speaks of it again. The house burns her poems. Her dresses are sold. Her name fades from the record books, replaced by a new girl's debut. It's not cruelty, it's ritual. The world turns forward, but not every farewell was bitter. Some courtesans planned their exit like their greatest performance. One held a farewell salon that lasted 3 days. No wine, no men, just music and memory. She played one final zither piece, burned her poems one by one, and left at sunrise, with her sister walking barefoot into the mist. Years later, a client claimed to have seen her running a mountain in near Suzhou, pouring tea like she used to, pour wine with timing so perfect. The steam always caught the light. Some farewells were written in advance. One woman, Jade Ink, left behind a sealed letter to be opened after her death. It contained a list of everyone she'd ever served and one line describing what they needed most. Not what they wanted, what they needed. Some entries were one word, others were poems. One just read, "He never looked me in the eye." That man reportedly donated half his fortune to a women's shelter. You lean against a carved railing, listening to the faint slosh of water against stone. A single heron stands still by the far bank, barely visible in the haze. Everything here is quiet on purpose. Courtesans knew the value of a silent exit. No fanfare, no begging, just a shift in light, and then gone. You notice a paper lantern, drifting slowly along the canal. It's lit. Someone must have set it afloat, just before you arrived. It carries no writing, no color, just a single flame inside, flickering with stubborn dignity. Maybe that's what a courtesan's real farewell looks like. Not an ending, just a gentle fading from one world into another. You close your eyes for a moment and think about all the women you've met tonight. No petal, winter lotus, the imitators and the legends. The ones who wore masks and the ones who removed them. The ones who left trails of perfume and broken hearts. The ones who will never be written about, but changed the air around them like incense. And somehow, they've all ended up here, in this moment. This breath, this silence. You take one last look at the canal, then you turn, and you leave. Now, let yourself slow all the way down. Sink back against the pillow. Let your shoulders drop. There's nothing else to follow, nothing more. To uncover, the lanterns have all been extinguished. The tea has cooled, and the musics are constant throughout this journey has finally drifted into hush. The courtesans of ancient China were never just ornaments or footnotes in someone else's story. They were architects of memory, engineers of desire, artists, working in silence, shadows, and stolen time. Some vanished without legacy. Others became myths, and a few, perhaps, are still wandering the echoes of moonlit corridors, barefoot and smiling. You've walked alongside them, now listened in on their jokes, their secrets, their grief. You've glimpsed what it meant to perform softness like a weapon, to turn pain into poetry, and to survive by never letting anyone quite know who you really were. So breathe in, slow and deep. Let the image of silk sleeves and flickering lanterns soften in your mind. Let the courtyards blur, the poems drift, the canals go still. And as you drift off, remember somewhere, in the folds of history and dream, a courtesan lights one last candle, just for you. Good night.